everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for our incredible panelists. I feel so lucky to be sharing a stage with you all. And thank you, Charlie, and the whole office group team for having us. So as Laura said, what we're going to be talking about today is reimagining the future of impact work and how it gets done. From conversations that we've had over the last few months since launching the Now Work, a huge portion of our community of independent experts and freelancers, the conversations that have come up were talking about how they've shifted ways of working because they were so burnt out. Working in sustainability has become unsustainable for them. So that's what we want to talk about today. How do we get more people activated and engaged within this space so that it becomes a space in an industry that people really want to work on? As Laura said, we need everyone on board operating at their aim game to address these huge systemic challenges that we are all collectively facing. So over to my panelists, we have Michaela Loesch, is that right?
Loesch, yeah.
Michaela Loesch, she is a climate justice activist and author of her new book, It's Not That Radical. Definitely recommend. You're co-host of the Yikes podcast. You're also a medical student. A lot on your plate. We have Karim Alpour, who's the co-founder and CEO of Neil, which is a global and decentralized teams platform for the creative industry. And we have Rachel Arthur, who is a sustainability strategist and writer. You're currently the advocacy lead for sustainable fashion for the UN Environment Program. So heavy hitters up here with me today. And based on everything that I just said, you all have a lot on your plate. As we've discussed, the whole sustainability industry, it feels like the more and more people we speak with, the more and more people we discover have been completely burnt out, are re-engaging in work in new and interesting ways. And when it comes to be something that feels like, okay, across the board, this is something that so many people are experiencing, it's no longer an individual issue that can be dealt with a nap and a face mask. It's actually a systemic issue if we're seeing burnout across entire industries. So that's what we want to look at addressing in our conversation today. So Michaela, I'll come to you first. With everything that you have going on, what's your personal experience of burnout? What has it been? How have you found ways to kind of keep doing everything that you're doing and kind of stay at it with everything?
So hi everyone, nice to see some lovely smiley faces. So my name's Michaela, and I juggle a lot of things, but I don't want to glorify juggling all the things, if that makes sense. I think that we live in this world in which it's celebrated a bit too much, this idea that you should do it all and burn yourself to the ground. And I think that if we're trying to build a better and transformed and liberated and genuinely better world, in the pursuit of achieving that world, we need to be living in pockets of it now. And I think that means how do we create cultures? How do we create environments in which we're not replicating the same systems that we say that we're against in the work that we're doing? I think often that quote from Audre Lorde gets used in the wrong way of the master's tools won't dismantle the master's house. In that entirety of that essay, she wasn't saying we can never use parts of an existing system to dismantle the system as a whole. She was saying we can't use the same kind of frameworks of dispossession and hierarchy and harm in work that's trying to be kind of doing the opposite of those different things. But I also come here today quite burnt out, I'm not gonna lie. And coming after, the last couple of years of writing a book whilst taking the government to court and doing other things at the same time, and then trying to get that book into the world whilst trying to tackle this ginormous climate crisis and capitalist system it's a lot, and not a small feat. But I think that the ways in which I have tried to moderate, I guess, that burnout or trying to move away from it, the only way you can really do that, I think, is in community and is with being with other people and feeling supported and loved by people. I think what you're saying about self-care has been almost has been commodified as this thing that you can buy. You can buy a spa day, or you can buy a massage, or you can buy a face mask and a bath bomb, and then everything's fixed. But capitalism's still going. And I think that the real way that we tackle these kind of systems that cause harm to each other is by humanizing each other at every moment, and therefore leaning into community and getting care from community instead. And so that's how I'm currently trying to moderate that, but also this kind of recognition. Sorry, I realize I'm speaking a lot. This recognition that when it comes to climate, every single person is important and valuable, and the role that everyone has is important and valuable. But at the same time, no one of us is going to save everything and fix everything. And so we need to tackle our own egos, I think, sometimes as well, and how much we can. I think that's what leads to burnout, is this idea that if I don't do this right now, no one's going to do it. And I think can be so much about how do we create space for other people, to teach other people what we've learned, and therefore to bring other people with us. And then the kind of weight of it all won't be held just on our shoulders alone.
Yeah, it's a lot to carry, to feel like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders all the time, especially when we're tackling such massive, huge issues. It's absolutely impossible for one person to really create huge systemic change just all on their own. We have to do it together. And Rachel, I know a lot of your work is operating at quite a systems level, looking at systems change within the fashion industry specifically. Could you share a little bit more about that when we're looking at systems level change? How does that work?
So working at a level like the UN, obviously trying to do systems change, I think to Michaela's point, is also recognizing no matter the scale of the organization, you also can't achieve everything. And what you have to figure out is where your place is within that. Similarly, what the place of the organization is within the larger landscape of what it is we're trying to shift. So breaking that down in of itself is an incredibly complex task. I've spent a lot of my life diving into theory of change documents, which is incredibly academic, but super important to work out exactly what it is that we're doing here, not least to figure out how we get funding for different parts of the work, which I'm sure we'll come on to in terms of the amount of time that's actually spent on funding documents versus doing the actual work, which, as Hannah knows, I have a bit of a bugbear with, but is par for the course. So I don't think I have a simple answer for how does one do systems change. It's just about analysing within all of that, what is the work that has to be done. Obviously, we have a theory of change document for what that looks like, but a really big part of it within the UN is figuring out what is our specific role and how does that divide up against other agencies. So, when we look at systems change in the fashion industry, we know that it is an enormous feat from both an environmental and a social standpoint, but as the UN Environment Programme, we're going to lean into the environmental side of things and work very closely with the ILO to work on the social factors. And it's about bringing those two things together, for instance. And then within that, there's a very nuanced piece of work that I work on very specifically, which again, I'm sure we'll come to, which is around the role of the consumer consumption, how we change consumption, not through the lens of the consumer, but through business and policy, and what that looks like, and about the different stakeholder groups and how we bring them together. So yeah, complicated systems is the whole point of systems change, right?
Yeah, definitely. If we're looking at the system of work as well and what that means and what does it mean for us as individuals as well as what we can achieve as organizations, and then at industry level systems change as well. That's kind of where we're hoping we start to see some shifts. And Karem, that's a huge focus of your work, and you're exploring lots of new types of infrastructure and systems for organizations to try to start facilitate more innovative thinking, more creative thinking as well. Can you tell us a bit more about your work at NEOL and specifically around decentralized networks?
Yes.
Great.
So first of all, to empathize with Michaela, I just returned from a 10-day trip yesterday, where for 8 days of the 10 days, I had my phone completely shut off. And I was like, this is the best thing. This morning, I woke up with the biggest anxiety attack imaginable. So I feel like for people who are passionate about the kind of change we can bring to the world, for people who are driven like you are, like I think most of us here probably are, we are both living in some of the greatest times because there's no shortage of struggles to be passionate about and go after, but it's also extremely stressful. To me, I've been an entrepreneur for now 10, 12 years, and I always thought big success stories were important until I realized that systemic change, big challenges can only be solved in actually very small increments. There's no big solution. There's no big win. There's no big change that just happens overnight because somebody, made a big difference in their own. So accepting that with humility has been probably the biggest teacher for the past 10, 12 years. At NEOL, we are, I guess decentralized is one way of saying it. We prefer calling it more of a community-powered system. Very similar to the ethos of actually the Now work. We believe that the kinds of challenges our humanity, our planet faces today cannot be solved by teams of people who simply work at companies. And there's many reasons as to why, but I think we can all agree that the way somebody joins a company, the way somebody progresses in their career, the way somebody goes through their life of, as a professional, is bounded by the structures that have been built many years ago. And as such, many people look for new ways. When they look for new ways, community starts to matter more and more, because you start feeling very lonely, you start feeling isolated, you start feeling like you are very small compared to the kinds of things you want to tackle. And that feeling of smallness is a very tough feeling. When you do join a community of practitioners, a community of learners, a community of mentors, you immediately jump into a new universe where you feel not bounded, not limited, not constrained, but expanded by who is around you. And that's kind of why we are building NEOL as a system where the community has shared ownership, the community has a purpose, but the purpose constantly gets redefined because we are in no position to kind of push a purpose down to a community. And then groups start forming what we call pods around certain systemic challenges, climate being the most important one at the moment, health, mental health especially, brands with purpose, reimagining cities, reimagining actually how nations brand themselves, which has a big implication on how they invite others into their countries and the kind of experiences they give to those people, which then has many connotations both culturally, climate-wise, and everything else. And we're very lucky that we are surrounded by great minds and hearts who are ready to tackle these challenges, and organizations who are looking for new ways to solve their challenges. So in a cryptic way, that's what NEOL is about.
I feel like a lot of what we're talking about, it's needing and requiring us to be very creative and innovative and imaginative in the next step, what that future could and might look like. And Michaela, just to go back to your book, it's not that radical. I think that's something that we quite often talk about, of how actually it feels really radical that we are like amazing, creative human beings in these like incredibly designed bodies on this wildly intelligent planet, and we've chosen to have work systems that cause us to see ourselves and other people just as units of labor. Like that feels crazy. Like that's radical. And a lot of what you're suggesting in your book of, yeah, you're right, it's not that radical to think, actually, let's like break that wide open. Let's design new systems. Let's have a new approach to how we see ourselves, how we see other people, and how we go about doing better, more impactful work that enables all of us on this planet to live better and in more balance with the environments that we're in. So I would love if you can speak even more to a lot of your thoughts on capitalism, but especially how that as a system defines our approach to work, and how can we start to rethink our approach to work?
That's a really really important thing I think about imagination in particular. Is like, I think just realizing that the world as it is now is the direct result of people's imaginations, and just realize even that small thing of the fact that every system that we have right now is something that someone once imagined and then became real because enough people believed in that imagination and decided to act on it, and that in some ways all of us in very different extents will be giving permanence to these systems by believing that they are like immutable, or that there's no alternative, or that this is all that there is. And I think that when we have that kind of recognition of the fact that everything that has been made by people, we realize that as people ourselves, we can unmake things, and we can make something different and something better. And it is like, when you really do sit down for a moment and think about the fact that we live in an economic system in particular that exists to just grow like that. Like we live in like capitalism. The economy has to double every, I think, 12 years, otherwise it fails. and that we've made this like, oh, but there's nothing else that we could have. There's nothing better there is out there. This kind of capitalist realism idea that that this is all that we can have, despite the fact that it's shown us and continues to show us that like that pursuit of growth, that pursuit of kind of extraction, that pursuit of more and more and more is causing harm to billions of people across the world, and also it's kind of heading us towards catastrophe, and it's completely incompatible with a livable future. And yet to even suggest that we should have something different is almost always presented as this like ridiculous ask, or this radical aim in that definition of the word of being kind of outrageous. And I think that redefining what is really outrageous is so important. The fact that in order to justify kind of this exploitation from people, in order to justify this kind of direct transfer of wealth from the majority of people to a very small amount of people, all of us are like kind of compelled to dehumanize the majority of people in this world. Like, we're quite deliberately manipulated to believe that like billions of people are not real humans, or are not willing of life, or are not willing, or are not deserving of resources. But somehow a very, very small percentage of the population, like literally 1% of the world's population, are deserving of more than the rest of the world. And that's completely bizarre. But we've been made to normalize that so much, or made to believe that there's nothing we can do about it. And I think that one of the functions of a lot of my work, but in this book in particular, is like, how can we challenge what we see as possible? How can we recognize that as people, as citizens of this world, we have a responsibility also to make something different, and that the way that we can do that is by coming together in movements and collectives, and really challenging the world as it is now, and having the kind of audacity to realize that we have to build something better, and that also that like we outnumber them. Like, there are more of the 99% than there are of the 1%, and we can actually have so much more power, I think, when we come together to try and actually build something better, and not even just that we can do that, is that like we must, with the climate crisis that we're facing. I don't like to like use doom and gloom and fear, and that's not my vibe at all. Like, I'm very much about, there's this kind of, I think, recognizing that we have these two paths. Like, if we continue the world as it is now, climate action will happen. So like, we are going to do, there will be a degree at which we will take climate action, but the actions that will be taken if we don't kind of intervene as the majority will be ones that continue to extract wealth from the majority of people. There'll be ones that make a worse world, a kind of an eco-fascist world. But if we actually decide to take this in our own hands, if we actually decide to build something better, we have an opportunity to build a better world. We have an opportunity to have a world where people are truly liberated, where we don't spend, like the majority of people are not spending all of their lives at work to only live in very insecure circumstances where they give all their money away to a landlord and never able to own their own home, or they are like steps away from homelessness. Like, we have an opportunity for a world where everyone gets to live in dignity, and that's not me just like saying it. There are many studies that have detailed what this world would look like, and it wouldn't require us like kind of going back to the Stone Age. It would require us going back to consumption levels of the 1950s for the majority of people, and no one exceeding that. So we have a possibility of something better, but I think that a big first step is us believing in that and recognizing that possibility. And then I guess from there it's acting with that possibility, and not compromising, in the sense that whilst we can't do everything as individuals, there's an essay called Bigger is Better by Aurora Levins Morales, who is a Puerto Rican Jewish writer and activist. And in there she writes, like, when we can't have everything now, how do we take the path that allows us to have everything in the future? So how do we not compromise that kind of the revolution, or the, like, you know, the better future? How do we not compromise that kind of liberated, amazing future, but recognize that the circumstances we're in right now might mean that we can't get it all right in this moment? I feel like I dropped a lot of random things there, so
Love
I hope that they found space in people's brains somewhere.
Lots of good insights.
But that's my thoughts on that.
Amazing. And Rachel, that's a lot of what the work that you're doing now is about, the role of imagination, of communication in helping to craft what that vision is, so at least we know the direction that we should be heading towards. And it's a fine balance between, and you've spoken about this as well, of the technical solutions versus the creative communications solutions, and it's all of the above. We need everyone on board to be doing this. We all need all our work to be moving in that direction. But can you speak to your work about technical solutions versus the creative and communication side, of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michaela, I was literally nodding along with all of that. And I think, this is why I work in the fashion sector, right? Because my personal view is that fashion is like the poster child for everything that you're talking about. Like, it is built on extraction and oppression fundamentally, but it also has the most fundamental amount of creative talent to be able to help us reimagine what new could look like. So a piece of work that I'm doing is based on not only trying to shape what that new future should be and sort of help to articulate it, but bring people into that journey to help them realize that they have not only a responsibility but an opportunity to do so with us. And I think a really important part of that is recognizing that, the creation of value and what we consider success fundamentally has to shift across all sectors. But within fashion, fundamentally, because we're building it on a growth model, it is about how can we continue to extract more and more from the earth fundamentally, get as cheap labor as possible, and churn it out in a way that we then just chuck it away and indeed, then continue with our similar modes of colonialism in terms of that waste. So changing that entire system is no small feat. It obviously is an entire systems change. But a big part of that starts with the narrative. It starts with all of us in terms of understanding what it is that we fundamentally believe in. And right now, we've been taught to believe that we have fundamentally a democratic right to access to cheap clothing, which is bonkers when you stop and think about it, because to your point, that's only possible because of the way that we oppress other people in the world. And therefore believe that that is something that we all have access to. And I think also, a big part of this is it's not just in developed nations. We're also putting that narrative on developing nations by celebrating the rise of middle class and giving them access indeed to fast fashion. So a shall remain nameless series of fast fashion brands land in these cities, and it is indeed a marker of success, of prosperity in the country, which fundamentally that is true based on our current markers of success. But that's what we need to change, because we need to radically rethink that narrative that is indeed what we should all be striving for, and that is a marker of indeed prosperity. So the work that we're doing has been around how do we shape up, in a very, very tactical sense actually, the role of the communicator within all of this and bring them into that journey. So within fashion at the moment, there are 8 million different variations of targets that we're all striving for, and there is nothing in there whatsoever that talks to the role of creativity and communication and to the role of narrative. So we've started to shape that up. We added a commitment into the Fashion Charter, which is part of the UNFCCC, back at COP26 in Glasgow, which was to say that all signatories, there's 160-ish signatories from across the fashion sector, brands and supporting organizations, they also commit to align communication efforts to 1.5 degrees of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, that's quite a lofty statement. Everyone's like, what does that actually mean? We were like, well, it's a really good point. We better go and figure that out. So I've been spending the past 18 months shaping that up, and putting it into a really tactical guidebook, basically, which we'll launch at the end of June. And essentially that looks at the role of, whether you're a communicator in a brand, so you might work in, marketing, social media, digital, editorial, you name it. You might work in an agency, you might be an influencer, an activist, and you might be in academia, you name it. You might be a journalist in the media themselves. All of these types of job roles have a role to play, and it's a really creative one. And what we're trying to do is show that, yes, there's a technical aspect to it. We have to all fundamentally figure out how do we not greenwash, especially with upcoming regulation in that space, and we talk a lot to that in the guidebook. But more than that, there's this other side of things, which is an existing skill set, which is the creativity that this industry has around consumer engagement. And we have to redirect that consumer engagement towards sustainable lifestyles. And we talk about what is a 1.5 degree lifestyle and try in some way to define that. But we also take really punchy messages on this, which is to say that we have to eradicate the way that we are pushing overconsumption in this industry. And we have to point people towards circular solutions instead. We have to reimagine what success looks like at large as an industry, as a society, but also fundamentally in these individual roles as communicators and creators. How are we KPI'd? Because right now, for the majority of people in marketing, it's obviously around how many conversions we can get and how many more products we can shift. And then we also have to start to push beyond, as I mentioned at the beginning, that role of the consumer. We don't want to put onus on the consumer for this change. We've got to look at that much wider system of business and policy, and also recognizing that as a communicator in all of these different types of roles, there is a really big lever there to pull towards demanding that change at that level, at that systems level, and striving for that policy shift particularly to happen, and putting that back in to shape what we consider to be, ideal, quote unquote, levels of production and consumption. And it is, I think, fundamentally for the first time in this sector, we've ever looked at what this role is and how it can contribute towards sustainability. And also recognizing, I think, Michaela, again, to your point, that we can't get there without this. We cannot meet any single sustainability target as is industry if we don't look at consumption. It's not possible because we're growing we're growing more quickly than we are actually reducing emissions, as one example, as one indicator, as an industry as a whole at the moment. So recognizing what's happening with growth and that sort of really fundamentally important part of that, I think, is key. And we can't do that unless we shift this whole narrative of the sector. And as I said at the beginning, I think fashion is a great poster child for this, because if we can figure consumption out in the fashion sector, I think we can apply it to a lot of other sectors as well in terms of what needs to change. So yeah, June is when we're going to launch it. Hopefully we'll be quite splashy about it. It's going to be punchy. There's a lot of people that aren't going to like it fundamentally, because we are talking about a systems challenge. It does really confront, that fundamental business objective, the motive that sits there at the moment, and that fact that at the moment we're measured on shareholder returns. But we have to confront that. It's the only way that we can start to change things.
Yeah, I think a couple of things based on what you were saying. One is how when you approach it with imagination and creativity, it ends up bringing so many more people into the space as well, and they feel really clear on the role that they can play in addressing the big challenges that we need to be addressing, like consumption, like the climate crisis. So I think that's one great takeaway, is looking at how do we just get more people involved? How do we leverage everyone's skill sets to work towards this future direction that we all want to head in? And I think the other point from what you said as well is the value and importance of honesty and transparency, and us just getting really clear on what does actually need to happen, and being quite frank with the discussion, as uncomfortable as it can make a lot of people, a lot of organizations whose whole objective is growth. And if we're telling them to deal with overconsumption, that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but how it's gotten to the point where we do just need to be really honest about what we're talking about, and how the transparency within the sustainability industry and how we're communicating with one another about the actions that we need to take and the direction that we need to move towards needs to come from that way of moving and that way of operating. And Karem, I know we've spoken a lot about the value of transparency, and how do you start to embed and integrate that into organizations? Can you speak a little bit of that, of what you've seen in the shift of how organizations are starting to embed transparency a bit more in how they're structured in their operations?
Organizations historically have had walls, like pretty thick walls actually. Some organizations thicker walls than others. It's that typical example of the McKinsey consultant, and their screens are blacked out. They can't be seen from any direction. It's for a reason. Organizations try to keep things to themselves. Nature, on the other hand, is quite the opposite. Our cells have membranes. We are constantly letting stuff in and letting stuff out. There's of course a filtering of what comes out, what comes in, and what comes out. But from a philosophical perspective, the idea is to not have thick walls and be, isolated, insulated from what's not within. I think that obviously four walls, being inside walls has had its positive effects for efficiency, for lack of transparency sometimes helped companies to succeed over one another. But when it comes to some of these bigger challenges that we are talking about, that model is just completely non-functional. And there's many ways we can discuss why it's non-functional, but I think we can at least take it for granted that um, what's happening within a system and what's happening outside the system, they cannot be blocked from one another when it comes to some of these bigger challenges, like climate, like health, like mobility, circular economy, regenerative economy. And as companies are realizing this more and more, they're trying to shift, they're trying to find new ways. But for many organizations, especially some of the bigger organizations, that shift is incredibly difficult, very painful. For some, it's almost impossible, and they need to destroy themselves and reinvent themselves. And that's a harsh truth. And I believe it's a matter of time. For some, it's 2 years. For some, it's 5 years. For others, it's 20 years. Maybe for some others, it's 50 years, but that will happen. And network-based systems, community-powered systems, by the way, a community-powered system, a community-powered organization doesn't mean you don't have boundaries, doesn't mean there is no inside and outside, doesn't mean information is just shared carelessly. It just means that your principle of how you come together and how you produce work is different. And that, we believe, is the future. That's how communities had been formed in the past, until relatively recent years. And we believe that going back to those models, not just from let's just rent a garden and, plant things, but rather actually imagine organizations that think about what they are building as not as structures, but as gardens, where they plant things, where they allow for diversity, where they design for diversity, in fact. We believe that that's the future we need to design for. And creativity, in many ways, gave rise to those organizational structures. And we believe that creativity is also the force that will be destroying those structures, and help us reimagine new structures. And that's happening in the talent world. That's happening in more operational structures. That's happening in the way we work, in the way we collaborate, and even compete. So we are seeing it happen all across. So I'm actually quite hopeful in terms of how we are organizing ourselves in the future.
Me too. And Rachel, back to you. The thing that I wanted to ask you is, with the work that you're doing, at an industry level, what is often required is collaboration between organizations who are quite fierce competitors. So when we think about how we are organizing ourselves to create systems level change, how do you get big competitors in the room together to actually agree and collaborate so that we can move forward, so that we can take these steps that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are constantly trying to figure that out, but we have done a lot of it. Obviously, we work, as I mentioned, with the Fashion Charter at the UNFCCC, so we already have that sort of buy-in, if you will, to that level of collaboration, and there are set working groups on different topics, of which Hannah used to participate in as well, and one particular working group around consumer engagement. So I think having those sorts of structures in place hugely helps. My personal experience has been that on an individual level, especially in this topic, everyone's super willing to collaborate. Everybody knows that change is needed. Everyone wants to do the work towards it. It's then getting, I guess, the organizational level buy-in for it. And particularly for when we then go beyond talking about it to actually actioning it. So I know within some of the other work that's happening in this space beyond the element that I've talked to, it's far more complex, because some of the changes that need to happen down the supply chain are currently, let's say, very, they work for the industry, right? They help prop up the system as it currently is. And so changing it, although it would help lead towards sustainability targets, is actually not that much of a motivator, because it actually does mean confronting a lot of the other challenges that we have in front of us. Whereas on the side of things that I am, because it is relatively new and it's about creativity, although there is that systems piece in terms of confronting what we mean by value creation, there's buy-in not only because people want to do it and they see opportunity in it, but because there's also regulation coming that means they need to get their heads around it, particularly on the greenwashing side. So I think we've had more openness to it. That said, because we're really early with the putting the guide out, so we've spent up to nearly 3 years of consulting on it. And in that sense, it's been incredibly collaborative. Everybody's been in these spaces together, talking about it all and everything. But we haven't yet get to the point of implementation. And I think that's when that will become very interesting, because in an ideal world, I don't want to have me and team working on a one-to-one level. I mean, the UN can't work on a one-to-one level with individual brands, right? That's not what the organization does, nor morally should it. So we need to do it at a collective level, and we need to convene around it. And I think when it comes to implementation, it will be really interesting to see if that competitive nature still sits there, and the willingness to actually start to talk about how we change narratives around this is possible to do in a collaborative sense. I think it will be around understanding things like regulation, but when it comes to that wider piece about how we confront consumption, I think we may face challenges. So yeah, I'll keep
Yeah,
you
please do.
posted. Yeah.
Stay tuned, everyone.
Yeah.
And the thing that's coming to mind now, based off of a couple of things that have been said, is this idea of a just transition. It's not like we can just hop to this new future tomorrow and everything's going to change and shift. It's going to be a process and a journey to get there. And Michaela, hope that you can speak to what a just transition is, and how do we get people on board to start taking more steps in that direction that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll get to the just transition.
Yeah.
I would also like jump on the back of what you're saying about supply chains, and but also on like willingness to do things, because I think that part of the reason that like the amount of kind of harm that exists in the world that is like necessitated by these companies, things happens, is because we've like given, whether we know we're doing it or not, we've given like many brands or industries or companies like this thing called like a social license, which we might not realize we're doing it, but we're basically, as a like society, saying, oh, this industry or this company or this brand or whatever is either like necessary or like is good or is important or needs to be there. And we there are many industries or many entire like kind of things in the past that I don't know, like asbestos, for example. We previously thought that was like something that is necessary or needed, and then as soon as it comes out that that's causing a lot of harm, its social license is removed and it can no longer kind of exist. Obviously, like slavery was another kind of industry in which that same removal of the social license happened, and that didn't happen because people handed it down from above. It happened because of people kind of sabotaging property and doing huge kind of campaigns to change the opinions of people. Boycotts, many different tactics were required in order for the kind of removal of that social license to happen. And so in a similar way, where we can't expect or kind of like, I don't think we can really like all be like, oh, please stop exploiting people to these brands, because we need to make it so they have to stop doing that. And the way they'll stop doing that is if their social license, in order to do it, is removed. So if it is that as a society we all recognize that it is not okay for someone to die in the collapse of a factory like Rana Plaza, there's the 10-year anniversary of that collapse that killed 138 loved humans because of not just kind of fast fashion brands like H&M and Primark, but also luxury brands like Gucci and Prada made their products there. If we say as a collective, and not just say it, but like we believe and we share our learnings together to say that these things are not acceptable, then that social license is removed, and these companies people firstly not just won't buy their products, but these companies won't be able to get like government support, or they won't be able to get all these different things. And an industry that is currently losing their social license day by day, more so than the fashion industry, which is good. I'm very glad for it, is the fossil fuel industry. But they are so obsessed with the social license, and like you'd be kind of forgiven for thinking that I don't know, Shell or ExxonMobil are really just energy companies. You know, they just really care about the climate, because all of their marketing is just like, we are like just, you know, wind turbines everywhere and smiley people. When in reality, like every fossil fuel company currently, almost all of them, have a maximum of like 6% of their kind of money being spent on renewables, when the rest of it is going to fossil fuels. So it's like a manipulation that's done because of this social licensing, so that they can get kind of fossil fuel subsidies, which is the thing that I took the government to court around, because the UK government give billions of our public money to fossil fuel companies, which is only able to happen because people don't really care enough about it. But I think that I just wanted to say that because I think that removing that social license is so important. So challenging what we see as normal or what we see as necessary is so important. And then on the just transition, what we're trying to do is I think that we act as if sometimes, similar to what you were saying before of like, it has to be this big thing that happens straight away or this big event or like, you know, this liberated future we're fighting for, it's going to be like one day, you know, this suddenly we cross the line and it's all changed. And I think that like this better world that we're building, it's a process in the same way that like, I think it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Andrea Davis both talk about abolition being like a process. It's like something that you build every day. It's about how do we make harmful systems obsolete. And to do that isn't to say we're not saying shut everything down overnight. It's how do we create a transition away from extractive kind of harmful world that uses, I don't know, fossil fuels and other exploitative means in order to exist and be propped up. How do we move away from that in a way in which we don't leave anyone behind, like we don't leave the workers behind that are currently working in these industries, that we protect their jobs, that we protect their lives, but also that we do it in a way that like allows our kind of collective to thrive as well. And I think that it's a very deliberate kind of tactic of these kind of exploitative companies to make out that what people who are kind of advocating for the rights of people are saying, or the rights of our planet, is that we're all like saying you should just shut it down overnight and like lose loads of people's jobs. And the fashion industry say this a lot as well. They're like, oh, we provide tons of jobs to people. The fossil fuel industry say the same thing. But both of these industries don't allow their workers to unionize, like very often. Or if they do, they bust their unions and they enact mass layoffs and very insecure like work environments. They don't really care about their workers. But I think it's important that we hold these kind of principles of what a just transition really is very close to us and in the way that we talk about these things, because it makes it very easy for us to kind of subvert what they're saying and show that what we're actually advocating for is just like building a better world, which happens day by day, and we might not see it all the time, but it is happening. Kind of like mycelium and mushrooms, like, you know, there's so much. Mushrooms are so cool. There's so much like mycelium under the ground everywhere as we're walking around. And they're building their networks, and we don't see it. But then, you know, you go foraging and you find this amazing mushroom, and you're like, wow, oh my gosh, incredible! The mushroom came out of nowhere, like found a chicken in the woods. So great. You can tell that I've got really into foraging recently. But you can think this came out of nowhere. That's amazing. And not recognize that there's been this kind of like nourishment that's been happening underground for so long. And I think that change is very similar in the way that we might not see the fruit of the mushroom of our work right now, but what we're doing is nourishing those networks to allow the mushroom to grow in the future, if you'll let me continue my analogy.
Great metaphor. Okay, I think we have some time for questions from anyone, if anyone has anything. We've covered a lot so far, from collaboration, various threads about capitalism, about community, about networks. Anyone want to chime in on? Oh, yes, please, go ahead.
Oh, I'm really nervous now. Thank you, speakers. Very, very interesting. What am I saying? I've had 2 Peronis. I'm an independent sustainability consultant. I'm part of the Now Work. To Michaela's point about the social license, I think like as people who choose to work for companies, there's a huge amount of complicity in what we do. So I have a job where my money is paid by companies that are doing things that I really don't agree with. And as an individual person going in, there's certain parameters of what you can say. And I would love to know of people who are in this room that work in the sustainability space, how often climate justice happens in a corporate setting. Like that is radical. Like it's not that radical a concept, but to talk about it as a freelancer really is. And so I think my question is about like people that depend on brands that are fundamentally propping up the systems. They're trying to change as slowly as possible. I've heard it referred to as like predatory delay. We'll set a net zero target in 2040 or 2050. We'll set some kind of easy 5-year targets, and we've got a diversity program. We're on it. And it's just complete bullshit. Yeah. But I don't say that, and I want to say it so much. And I do say it, and I do my activism in my spare time for free when I'm tired. And so I guess my question for the group really is, how do we become more radical as people that work within these contexts, given you might be an individual person and so you don't have that political capital? And I do not know how to answer that and also like earn some money. So I would love people's thoughts on that, about how we push that envelope further, because I feel there's a lot of complicity, and I'm not happy with it.
Could I say something quickly on that?
Yeah, please do.
I think that what you're saying about the way that these kind of harmful systems will adapt is so important to recognise as well. I mean, I've, undercover sat into oil and gas meetings when they used to make them open in Edinburgh, and they quickly learned not to do that. And they would do a whole presentation about we're going to go net zero, but until that moment, we're going to extract as much oil and gas out of the ground as possible. But we're going to keep telling everyone, they have like a picture of Kermit the Frog on the slides, and they were like, it's not easy being green. And they're like, that's the image we can put out, but we are going to get as much oil and gas out of the ground as possible until that date, which is completely contradictory to any idea of actually kind of having a livable future. So recognizing that, I think that so I would be like an abolitionist. So my perspective is that these harmful systems should be made obsolete, and we should move away from them and not allow them to adapt or reform. I think that there is something to be said about how can we be thinking we're doing the right thing, but allowing a harmful system to just exist for longer. Like, by working with an oil and gas company to do a diversity program, is that not just making them look a bit better than they actually are, and therefore they can exist for longer, and there'll be less kind of resistance to them? And so I think there is something to be said there about and there's a lot of really great work that the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty are doing around doing a whole kind of careers aspect of trying to get people to sign on to a pledge that they will never work with the oil and gas industry or the fossil fuel industry. I think that that's really great. But I also recognise that we do live in it's a difficult world in which it's people do need to survive as well. But I think it's recognising that are you doing this because you need to survive, or is it that you are profiting significantly off harm? And I think there's a big difference there, and I think sometimes we can not recognize that difference, and we'll but I love that you direct your question to the audience, because I want to hear from people. Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah. I was at an event today where they were talking about the only true agency is really in collective agency, and the consumer story has made us think that we own, we have our individual agency to focus on. And I was just nodding my head and loving hearing you articulate this work to remove the social license. I am really excited to be here. I know some of the founders of the Now Work, but I run Creators for Climate, which is a nonprofit creative network for individuals doing values-aligned work, and we do a ton of activism to remove the social license of the oil and gas industry. And one of our KPIs or our goals is to normalize activism within advertising. And we were just doing this on impulse because we thought it was cool and fun and radical until we met funders, and they were like, this is what a theory of change is. This is what a social license is. So I would say that I'm also a consultant / sometimes a freelancer, and have built this because I feel stronger with others. So if I can just, I honestly think that's the only way that I can make sense of it, because essentially we're the lowest in the food chain and we have the least kind of internal power, but together we can be stronger, right?
To build on that, I think one of the things we've talked about quite a lot in this work for the fashion industry particularly is about those internal levers of change, and how, if you're somebody, and in this instance, but obviously it applies to all roles, but in the instance of the communicator, that you're recognizing the power that you have to help drive that change externally. There's also a massive role to play internally in terms of that piece of advocacy. So I think in your particular example, although we talk about the balance between incremental and systems work, and I've been through that on a sort of personal level with my career journey of recognizing that a lot of the work I was doing sort of 5-10 years ago in sustainability was just, ticking boxes, as I'm sure all of you have experienced, and recognizing that the business was continuing in the same way, but making themselves feel really good about themselves. And I sort of I tried to address that in terms of taking on work that I believed was at least contributing to wider systems change, even if in that individual project it wasn't necessarily going to fundamentally help shift it. But then I think that there's this bigger piece around recognizing that your role is not only just with that business, but it's with the people in that business. And if you are having an influence on them towards change, they may not continue in that individual organization, but there's a ripple effect, right? And I think that's super interesting with advocacy work, and the same, through advertising, the impact that can have in terms of getting more people on board with recognizing how much it is that we need to change the social license in every single way, and it needs all of us as a participant in that.
I think to your question, what needs to change? If we see climate or sustainability as a field we invest in, or we choose to invest in or not, I think that's the wrong question. If we think of it as an era we exist in, similar to we existed in the internet era, industrial era, pre-industrial era, it's literally an era we found ourselves in, and everything we do literally, from how we employ people to how we think about operations, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, to our messaging, literally everything we do as an organization, as a country, as a municipality, as an individual, is according to that era that we live in. You know, today we laugh at a company that didn't go through their digital transformation, and we call it the backward company. Who wants to work there? Or a company that's selling tobacco is the old school company. It literally needs to have that same sentiment, simply because of the era we live in. So when we think of it as an industry, then the question becomes, do you invest in this industry or not? Do you invest in this sector? Do you see opportunities in this or not? I think that's a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about it. When you think of it as, this is an era we exist in, do we all agree? Nobody denies that the internet era happened, right? We simply found ourselves in it, and we did things accordingly. We didn't try to, push against the current. This needs to be seen exactly the same way, and this era will probably continue for the rest of our lives. So it will not have an end, and it will not be disrupted because a new era will start simultaneously. So it's something significantly bigger and bolder.
Yeah, it's like, how do you work in the system and fight the system at the same time? That's hard. Oh, yeah, another question.
Hi, 2 points. So one, I'm also an independent sustainability consultant and also have the same struggles as you. I think there is, though, a growing movement now of consulting activism out there online. I can connect you up with some people that are involved in it if you want afterwards, because I think there's a lot of us that feel that frustration where, you know, certainly in years gone by, we've been quite complicit and just agreed with what the client says is their restriction and what they can do. And you know in your heart that's not what they need to be doing, but you've just sort of gone along with it. But I think we all need, as consultants, to sort of stand up and tell the truth and really put it down to the client in terms of what they should be doing, what the science tells them they should be doing. And the more of us that do that, I think the more the message is going to get through. And even if we might not win the work that time, we might plant a seed in that client's head that they, sort of grows and actually over time they start to change their ways as well. So yeah, I completely understand your frustration with it as well. But yeah, I'll speak to you afterwards because there's quite a big movement now around this. And then a question to the panel, I guess to Rachel mainly, but around degrowth. So I think, and I know there's a conversation, debate around degrowth and green growth has largely been discounted by many, but so I agree with you on the degrowth agenda. I'm just intrigued in the guide and what you set out, because I think, you know, in the current system that we operate in, it's completely designed, as everyone's mentioned, around growth to sustain it itself. So how can one industry, one sector, one company, one brand sort of go against that at the moment, and whether your guide talks to that at all? Because unless there's fundamental change in how governments at the first point, you know, look at GDP and use that as the main measure of how well the country is doing, that needs to go. And then the finance and economic system that we operate within, even, you know, state communism in China is, you know, it's all about growth still. So I don't know, I still struggle with how do we actually get this across when we're speaking to, you know, the CEO, the C-suite, the board of a PLC, a listed company, and the pressures they've got around growth. Kind of, yeah, do you talk to that in your guide and kind of any tips, I guess, when we're talking to clients about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm also doing a separate piece of work that I probably can't talk about in detail yet, but on exactly this topic outside of the UN for another organization around what this should look like within the fashion sector particularly, and specifically as it comes to virgin resource extraction and how we try and separate those two things in terms of growth. When it comes to the guide itself, so we talk about it in depth. We talk about what that looks like within this systems challenge. We don't provide answers in it because it obviously goes beyond the scope of the communicator role, but we talk about what that communicator role should look like and the way that they can help play into changing that current system, if that makes sense. So we talk about decoupling within it, and what that should look like relative to value creation. But actually, genuinely, to be completely transparent about it, what we talk about mainly is the complexity of it and how it isn't super simple, and we have to confront it as an industry, and consumption is a massive part of that. But that we have to try and extract that piece of value creation, as I said, that marker of success that we have as an industry and being answerable to shareholders. And we try to unpack it in some way. And then within the very tactical part of the guide, it's around, okay, if we're eradicating messages of overconsumption, what are we actually saying that you shouldn't do? And what are the alternatives of what you should do instead? And I think what will follow for us, hopefully, will be around working, as I said, in a collective way with some organizations about how we look at implementation of this and how we confront some of those challenges accordingly. But I don't think there are simple answers to your point. Like, it is so nuanced. And I think there are some interesting examples of brands, certainly on the smaller end of the scale, that are really looking at this. But for the large scale organizations, this is so complicated. I mean, we've had, like, Ralph Lauren has talked to the idea of the fact that it's looking at degrowth, quote unquote, and it said it once in a New York Times article and it hasn't talked about it again. So that's kind of interesting. Kering has recently announced that, it's looking at absolute emission reductions, which I do think is interesting. People are very cynical and skeptical about. But what I actually find interesting is that it's set up a sustainable financing department, which I think is fascinating because it's recognizing that it has to live at that level as opposed to it just living in a siloed sustainability team. So I think the conversation is happening. People are recognizing it, and I'm hoping that what we put out helps contribute to that conversation. But it definitely doesn't give all the answers at this point. But hopefully it will start to open up more of what needs to happen.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This has gone by incredibly quickly, and we've talked about a lot of very big topics, from what our impact work needs to focus on and how we get it done as well, how big and challenging it is, and how we don't really have many of the answers, but the one answer that we do seem to agree on is the importance of community and coming together and collaborating and being together to craft and develop some of these solutions. And hopefully that in and of itself ends up being quite a big solution to some of the other big challenges that we're facing as well. So thank you so much to Charlie and Reese and the whole TOG team. Thank you, Michaela, Karem, Rachel, for joining us. And thank you all for coming and participating and being a part of our community together. So if you want to follow along with our conversation, please follow us at The Now Work, and we'll see you soon.